Okay, I can see people are still coming in, but just so we don't run too late, I'm going to start talking and just doing some introductions, and as people join, we'll move on to our speakers. First of all, welcome everyone. It's so nice to have you all here. It's so nice to have our panel here. My name is Dina Lupin. I am the Deputy Director of the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment, the GNHRE. And we at the GNHRE are absolutely delighted to be hosting today's webinar on feminist and queer approaches to environmental law and rights. This webinar is part of the Ecological Law and Governance Association's monthly webinar series. This is the second year, I think, that we've done this with Elgar. They are such fantastic partners. It is so wonderful for us to be able to do this. Thank you to Katie and to Peter who invited us to do it. And they are just wonderful partners to work with. And they host a webinar, a fascinating webinar every month in their webinar series. And I strongly recommend that you all go and have a look at their website and have a look at their upcoming webinars and attend them all. And we'll put a link to Elgar's website in the chat box. Just to introduce the Global Network quickly, the Global Network is a network of thinkers, researchers, policymakers, and community activists. We produce, exchange, and learn from world-leading scholars and practitioners and communities working at the interface between human rights and the environment all over the world. We host book launches, we host webinars, we commission and publish blog posts on brand new developments in the field. We have a research repository that is one of the most comprehensive sources of environmental and human rights scholarship that there is. We run a mentoring program, we share and promote the work of our brilliant members. And this year, in collaboration with the United Nations Environment Programme, we're going to be hosting our first summer winter school online. So please check out our website. We'll also post a link to that in the chat box, and sign up if you're not a member already. Before I hand over to our brilliant panelists, and before we kind of start this webinar in all sincerity, just a few administrative matters. This webinar is being recorded. So please turn off your video if you don't want to be recorded. And please, could you stay on mute during the webinar? It will be 90 minutes long, but if for some reason we lose Wi-Fi or we hit a technical glitch, please just give us a couple of minutes and then log back in, and we should be able to carry on. If we have lots and lots of technical problems, which I highly doubt, then we'll find a time to reschedule. The panelists are each going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. Given that we are quite a big crowd today, which is really fantastic, I would ask that you write your questions in the chat box, and then we will collate those questions and read them out, and we will try and pose as many questions as we can to the panelists, and maybe just say who your question is directed at, if it's directed at a particular member of the panel. I think that's the admin. Today we have 4 expert panelists, each of whom I'm going to introduce just before they speak, kind of one at a time. And we've asked our panelists to talk on the theme of feminist and queer approaches to environmental law and rights. Queer and feminist theories and theorists and activists have, over the last few decades, questioned and interrogated and really changed many of the ways we traditionally understand the environment and many of the ways in which we have assumed we ought to be regulating the environment. They've argued for a need to change the ways we regulate the spaces, the places, the landscapes in which we live. To my mind, what is particularly critical about queer and feminist scholars and activists is that they have, over the last few decades, unrelentingly and untiringly demanded that we attend to practices of oppression and marginalization, of racism, of misogyny, of transphobia, of homophobia, of the violence and colonialism and subjugation embedded in many of our engagements with and our regulation of the environment across time and around the world. And so I think there's no better time than now, in a moment of environmental crisis, in a time of zoonotic pandemic, to think about environmental law again through feminist and queer lenses, to look at the way in which our law maybe should be evolving and changing in light of those perspectives, but also to maybe look at the way in which those perspectives are changing in response to our new conditions. So, on that note, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Dr. Emily Jones. Dr. Jones is an international lawyer whose interdisciplinary work combines theory and practice. Her work cuts across feminist and queer approaches to international law, international environmental law and the rights of nature, the law of sea and deep sea mining regulation, science, technology and law, and posthuman legal theory. Emily is currently working on a monograph on feminist theory and international law and posthuman perspectives, which we published with Routledge's Glasshouse series. We're very excited to have her with us today, and she's going to be talking on posthuman feminism and the rights of nature. Over to you, Emily.
Great, thank you very much, Dina, and special thanks to you and to Katie for organising this event. I'm really excited to hear from all our speakers today and to speak more about feminist and queer approaches. So I have 15 minutes, which is quite a challenge. I think I set myself a lot in my title, and then I realised that as I was writing this paper, and I've suddenly realised that there are so many people in this webinar whose work I use all the time and really like, so I'm a little bit, I can't possibly do you all justice, but I'm going to do my absolute best. So yeah, my title is Posthuman Feminism and the Rights of Nature, and if you don't know what posthumanism is, don't worry, I promise I'm going to explain it in a hopefully understandable way, and you can tell me off if I don't. But broadly, I'm going to be arguing in this paper that international environmental law is anthropocentric and that posthuman feminist theory may be used to challenge that anthropocentrism. But thinking about how this could be done practically, because as Dina mentioned in my bio, I'm interested in not only theory, but also the practical implications of this. My suggestion is that there are connections between posthuman feminist theory and the rights of nature movement. So I'm going to outline what some of those kind of convergences are and outline obviously some of the tenets of the rights of nature movement, but I can't possibly go through all of them. But yeah, I want to kind of think about what are the links between these two perspectives, but then also thinking about what can posthuman feminism actually add to thinking about the rights of nature as well. So that's kind of where I'm going here. And a little bit of background about the origins of my work. So as Dina mentioned, I'm a feminist international lawyer. A lot of work on gender and international law focuses very much on women's lives and lived experience. And if we think about feminist engagements with international law, they've overwhelmingly been focused on kind of women's representation or sexual violence in conflict. Those are probably the two things that we think of most. And a lot has really been achieved here. But as an interdisciplinary scholar and as someone who has a background in gender studies as much as I do law, I'm really interested in, well, what else can be said? What else is there? So my kind of questions that led me to this research was really, does gender theory only impact on international law when we're thinking about women's lives and lived experiences? And what can the kind of epistemologies of gender studies bring to international law in general? So thinking beyond kind of what could be seen as women's issues alone and showing actually that feminist epistemologies, gender epistemologies can, impact on how we see international law in general. So that's kind of how I got to this, and then my interest in environmental law as well, it kind of came together, and that's how I got to this research really. So I should probably now get to the point where I tell you what posthuman feminism is, which would be a good start. So posthuman theory broadly lies at the convergence between posthumanism on the one hand and post-anthropocentrism on the other. So what I mean by posthumanism is that it seeks to dismantle the hierarchies between humans, so gender, race, class, etc. But also, and then so really bringing into conversation intersectional feminism here, but also post-anthropocentrism by kind of dismantling the idea that the human sits in hierarchy over all others, including the non-human animal, environment, and also machines. There's a whole kind of technology branch as well there. So post-human feminism really draws on this long history of feminist engagement with the environment, from ecofeminism to feminist new materialism, alongside intersectional feminism and these other forms. And I think it's important to kind of bring those together, the kind of more new materialist aspect, so thinking about the liveliness of matter, which I'm going to explain, don't worry if you're not familiar with this, but with the kind of intersectional perspective, so decolonial, thinking about class and all of these different elements. So this is what I'm really going to be focusing on. So I want to first start off again by talking about why international environmental law actually needs post-human feminism. So I have to make this argument very, very quickly because of the amount of time that I have. But basically what I'm trying to argue, and hopefully maybe most of you agree, is that international environmental law is for the most part anthropocentric. So it separates and prioritizes human interests over and from environmental and non-human interests. So we can think about how international environmental law is made up of loads of different instruments and treaties, and they all have different levels of protection and obligation. And they're focused on sort of specific environments or kind of specific rules. And this fragmentation, I guess, of international environmental law really kind of means that different environments and different human interests, etc., are all treated separately and very differently. But in the end, international environmental law ends up prioritizing really human interests and very particular human interests over all others. I think capitalism is a very kind of key element here. So if we think even about sustainability discourse, how can we kind of extract things sustainably? That still is playing into this kind of economic logic of capitalism in many ways. So my point here really is that international environmental law is failing to account for the interdependence and connectivity of all beings and environments, and prioritizes human interests over all others. So this leads me on to post-human feminist theory, which, if you remember, I broadly defined this as sitting at the convergence between post-humanism and post-anthropocentrism. But if we're thinking specifically about environmental issues, the reason that I think post-human feminism is so interesting to think about international environmental law is because it actually tries to challenge the anthropocentrism within Western thought. So if we can kind of apply that to the law, which also is very anthropocentric, what can we learn? So really seeks to challenge this idea that humans are the central subjects and the environment is an object which can be exploited, by noting the kind of liveliness of matter itself. So broadly, these theories stress the force of living matter. They talk about how we're not really in charge of those it's. Humans, non-humans, environments are all interconnected. And this really comes from ecofeminist ideas. So Caroline Merchant, for example, very much stressed the relation between humans and the non-human world. Humans adapt to nature's environmental conditions, but then nature also responds to us. So the repercussions for thinking international environmental law here are quite clear. If we think about the way in which the law separates humans and non-human interests into different spheres, it's kind of fragmenting them so that we don't actually see those connections and end up prioritizing really the human subject. So, what happens really if we start to see these interdependencies and these connections is kind of what I think a post-human feminist approach brings to this. So turning to the rights of nature, and I'm briefly to kind of go over some of the different elements of the rights of nature, and then I'm going to come on to explain how I think post-human feminism and the rights of nature link. But these kind of, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the rights of nature. Rights of nature have been recognised in multiple contexts. I think it's over 25 states have now adopted such provisions, from New Zealand, India, the US, Ecuador, etc. So, and some states have also pushed for the international recognition of the rights of nature. And I think that's quite interesting. How could a sort of global rights of nature standard potentially challenge some of these issues that I've identified with the anthropocentrism of international environmental law? But to kind of give a broad overview of some of the elements of the rights of nature, I can't possibly cover everything here, and I know there are many experts in this webinar right now, so difficult task. But I think key thing to emphasize is the role Indigenous peoples have played here. And as I said, intersectional feminism is really core to my project. And you know, they've been really core in the recognition of rights of nature in Ecuador's 2008 constitution, also in New Zealand. And even though Indigenous peoples have not been kind of central to all the recognitions of the rights of nature. So, for example, there's a bill in the Philippines that's being proposed right now around the rights of nature, and they're not kind of necessarily involved in that. I think it's really important to remember that Indigenous peoples have been central in casting these kind of ways in which the law can be framed through the rights of nature. And it's something I'm going to kind of come back to as well. And I think another kind of core element, and one which concerns me a little bit, is there is a tension between whether nature as a whole is recognised in these different domestic provisions, or whether a specific environment is recognised. And I guess you can see where I'm going with this. If I'm arguing that everything is very connected and you know, humans, non-humans and environments that are kind of connected, then that could be a bit of a problem. So, for example, Ecuador's 2008 constitution outlines nature rights as being inherent to the earth itself, so they apply across Ecuador. There are different issues with how they've been applied, which I don't have really time to go into here, but I think that that's an interesting model if we're trying to set a kind of global standard. If we look to New Zealand, however, there have been kind of two agreements with Maori people here, and one is in relation to a particular river, which I'm sure you all know about, and the other one is a forest. But the boundaries of these two environments are very, very much, they're legally defined within the kind of treaties that were drawn up. So, and this tends to be a kind of more prominent model that's being used. So the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India have also had their legal personality recognised, but it's again very bounded. So I think, you know, it's kind of interesting to think about Ecuador's provision in particular. How can we think about all of nature as having these kind of rights? But there are also some limitations to the rights of nature, and that's kind of what I want to look to now, because I think posthuman feminism and intersectional perspectives can help answer some of these questions that are left open, or some of these tensions. So one kind of core tension is who represents nature. So posthuman feminist theory, as I briefly mentioned, given the time limit, it posits that nature has agency. It's kind of alive, it's vibrant. So if rights of nature are to be upheld at law, humans obviously have to represent nature. But how can we put forward those claims on nature's behalf? And this is a question I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and it's really difficult because scientists don't often agree what is best for nature. So how do we kind of balance this? And from a posthuman feminist perspective, this becomes even more complex. So Vicky Kirby, who's a posthuman feminist, argues that actually to represent nature is to risk reinscribing a humanist and anthropocentric blueprint through a kind of human framing of what nature is and what it wants. So if nature is actually, you know, self-organizing, has its own language, you know, how can we possibly interpret that? How can we possibly represent that in court? So, and Donna Haraway makes a similar sort of argument. She talks about how if the world is really a witty agent with an independent sense of humor, and those are quotes from her, then how can that wit, that agency, ever be fully understood by humans, let alone represented by them non-reductively within courts? So, but I think that this to some extent may be a problem with Western thought, of kind of thought within a sort of Eurocentric worldview, because if you look at Indigenous cosmovisions, they're very, very different. They have a different answer. So this was actually discussed during the kind of provisions in New Zealand, and in particular in relation to the legal personhood that was given to the kind of forest and natural park. There's a kind of organisation that represents the Taha Iwi, who are the Maori group who were kind of requesting this legal change. Christy Luke, who in 2013 actually argued, and this is a quote, that ownership and owning of Te Aroa has been a mechanism to destroy belonging and care, and therefore community. Ownership granted entitlement, but without having earned it. Ownership does not value kinship and the things around us. It breeds very transactional relations between humans and the land. So in here, a kind of legal personality model was adopted, and you know, it's kind of seen as, well, the people and the environment are inherently interconnected. So it's not so much a kind of problem that we need to think about that representation through this particular worldview. And I think a lot can still be learnt from thinking about what Indigenous peoples would have to offer on this particular question. But yeah, that's kind of one problem. But then the other problem with the legal personality model is, well, if you just add another legal person into the framework, you know, is that really so good? I mean, we can see this with women's rights. If you add women and stir, which is kind of the thing that's often said, you just add women to human rights, for example. Sure, that's really great, and often sometimes harms are recognized, but it doesn't change the system itself. You know, we've seen massive problems with, like, actually kind of, you know, the recognition of new rights that maybe would better serve women's interests. So does just adding nature as another legal subject just kind of add it in, incorporate it into the kind of liberal legal system without challenging it and changing it itself? But, you know, feminists have already long answered these kind of tensions. And so feminist legal theorists and feminist international lawyers in particular, they use this language of resistance and compliance. How can you work within the system to change it and transform it while recognizing that the system itself is inherently problematic? And I think that's a really good way to think about the rights of nature. You know, in some ways, rights of nature was unthinkable a few decades ago. It really wasn't kind of on the kind of global map, but it is gaining momentum, and I think it has a lot of potential to really challenge the way we think. And it's kind of both inside and outside the system in that sense. And I think, so I don't think that we should kind of give up on it, is what I'm saying. I am aware of, I'm running out of time, so I'll kind of quickly go over my last points. I told you I set myself an impossible task in 15 minutes, but another problem is really kind of thinking about universalism. If I kind of want to propose a global rights of nature standard, that suggests a universal, but as we all know, I'm sure that feminists and post-colonial theorists have a lot of problems with universalism. What is the universal? It just ends up becoming the kind of white man again, doesn't it? International environmental law has tried to tackle this in some ways. We can think about differentiated responsibilities, etc. But ultimately, I think if we're thinking about kind of colonialism, global power dynamics, this becomes, you know, a problem. It's not just a problem for the rights of nature, it's a problem for all kind of these universalizing projects. And here I kind of get a bit of a loss. I think we could learn a lot more from kind of Marxist approaches to international law, decolonial perspectives, degrowth, etc. But I can't possibly go into all of that in this time either. So I should probably wrap up because I don't want to take up other people's time. But basically, I tried to argue that international environmental law is anthropocentric. Posthuman feminism might be used to try and challenge that anthropocentrism. And I think there are a lot of links between posthuman feminism and the kind of aim to see nature as a vibrant acting subject and the rights of nature movement. So, you know, it could be one way of actually applying these theories in practice. But at the same time, I've sought to kind of understand how posthuman feminism may, in turn, also help us think about the rights of nature. So through the kind of limitations arguments that I made. I guess I want to end on calling for solutions beyond kind of what most existing feminist engagements with international law currently imagine. So there's a big shift at the moment for the Women, Peace and Security agenda to actually take up environmental issues. And I think that's really problematic. If we want to give, you know, it's about securitization, and we know there's been a lot of problems with this agenda. I mean, there's a need to be really, really careful here. So, and do we really want to give these permanent 5 members of the Security Council power over the environment as well? That's another big question, and it brings up colonialism and all sorts. So I guess what I want to argue for is that posthuman feminism and the rights of nature can be an alternative way of thinking about this. And that's what I hope I presented in my paper today. But I am out of time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Sorry for that. pause. Thank you. That was really interesting, and I think leaving us with sort of thinking about how we look for solutions beyond what's available that are both outside and inside at the same time is a really good sort of kickoff point for the next talk, which is going to be given by Professor Atieno Mboya Samandari. Atieno holds a Master of International and Comparative Law from Georgetown University and a Doctor of Juridical Science from Emory Law School, where she is currently based. She was a winner of a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, and she did her research on the role of human rights education in promoting democratic transitions at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Professor Samandari has served as a consultant for UNICEF and the World Bank on gender equity and human rights, and has authored over 20 books on the right to food and health and education. And today she's going to be talking about ecofeminist approaches to climate change. So over to you.
Thank you, Dina. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I have to say 15 minutes. This is a big scramble for me right now because I was under the impression I had a little longer time than that. And in many ways, listening to that amazing presentation by Emily Jones, I'm thinking mine probably should have come earlier because I'm squarely in the human arena here when I'm talking about ecofeminism. I'm not really in the post-humanist area, but I'll go ahead and share what I have, and hopefully we can continue the discussion during the Q&A. I'll just go ahead and share my screen, and oh gosh, hopefully my internet will hold up here. I'm actually joining in from Kenya. Normally I'm totally fine with internet, but on the odd occasion that it dies, I may actually end up, okay, here we go. Turning off my video so that, anyway, right now, I'll stay with my video on and hope it works out. So basically, I'm looking at, ecofeminist approaches to climate change. We all know that climate change is the quintessential environmental issue facing humanity today. And the interesting thing about climate change, of course, is that the response mechanisms that have been put in place through first the Kyoto Protocol and now the Paris Agreement that built on that protocol are basically market-based mechanisms, okay? The creation of a carbon market, carbon trading to respond to a global problem that's been created by carbon is very problematic. And it's really a capitalistic sort of solution to a problem that is then not generating solutions, because we know emissions have been rising and there's no end in sight in terms of the inequality that even's been being generated through not just emissions from global north and global south, but also the new market that's been created and the new wealth that's been created through carbon trading is deepening inequality, global inequality, and inequality within countries. And so really, by bringing in the ecofeminist lens to the climate issue, we're really going back to the areas, to this whole idea of inequality and social justice and the need for climate justice, and what does an ecofeminist lens bring to this discussion. So I looked quickly at the norms of the climate regime, and these norms, they're good on paper, but their implementation, of course, has been problematic in that emissions are still rising and global inequality is rising, and the north-south divide continues to grow. So what are these norms? They're basically, I'd say there's 7 norms, okay? There's the generational equity one, sustainable development, very familiar things to those of us in the environmental field, okay? Common but differentiated responsibilities, the precautionary principle, vulnerability, which is a new norm emerging through the climate regime, and then, of course, the age-old, in many ways, age-old call by the Global South for a supportive and open international economic system, and then loss and damage, which has become a big priority, especially for small island states, and coastal communities whose very existence is threatened by climate change and rising sea levels. So, you know, the norms, they're hopeful. When you look at them on the face of them, they're actually very hopeful norms. But as I was working on my research in climate change and gender, I realized that the operationalization of these norms is problematic in that they pretty much continue the global status quo and the idea that growing the economy is the solution to finding answers to climate change. And so then the question becomes, how are we growing the economy? Of course, the obvious answer is that we want to grow the economy using clean energy. And then the argument that follows that is that clean energy is so expensive. In the meantime, you know, we need time to make this transition, but, you know, the time between sort of the 1990 emissions levels to sort of everyone being on a low carbon threshold from 2030 onwards, it doesn't look like we're going to make it. Certainly the contributions, the commitments that states have made under the Paris Agreement show that we are woefully short of meeting these commitments. So where does ecofeminism come in? What is ecofeminism? I'm not really sure if everyone here is you know, from environment and gender, etc. So I won't, I'm imagining some of my students joined and I know they were very interested in this idea of ecofeminism. So just really quickly, ecological feminist thinkers basically draw on the concept of gender to analyze relationships between humans and the natural world. And of course, in this case, we're looking at humans and the atmosphere, right? And, you know, ecofeminists use basic feminist tenets of equality between the genders, a revaluing of non-patriarchal, non-linear structures, and a view of the world that respects organic processes, holistic connections, merits of intuition and collaboration. So these are the if you like, these are the tools, the ways of thinking, the approaches that ecofeminism is bringing into, you know, the climate conundrum that we have right now. And one of the main things that we find from ecofeminist thinking is that patriarchal norms are really recognized to be an incomplete view of the world. And when we look at, you know, sort of the origins of law itself and, you know, coming out of capitalism with contract and real estate and who was owning the real estate, of course, it was, you know, wealthy land-owning white men. Really, the origins of our field itself lie in patriarchy. So when we're looking at the climate regime, it's no different, okay? So the idea that sort of a patriarchal approach to capitalism and growing the economy and building a legal framework that will resolve the problem of a warming climate. For ecofeminists, this is really a continuation of sort of the patriarchal answers, legal answers that we proffer for different problems. And so the argument then is that this is an incomplete view of the world, and alternate views that value the earth as sacred, recognize humanity's dependence and interdependence with the natural world, and embraces all life as valuable, building on what Emily said. These are all, you know, important thoughts that have to be brought to the table. So just really quickly, I won't go through each particular principle. I can probably talk about it more in the Q&A, but you can see that one of the interesting things with the new norms that's come through the climate regime, the vulnerability norm, it's really right now positioned as, you know, the sort of the vulnerable groups, there's the vulnerable countries, there's the vulnerable communities, suggesting that there's other countries and groups that are quote unquote not vulnerable to climate change, while we know that this is a universal phenomenon. The vulnerability to climate change is universal. It's just the resilience is not evenly spread out. The resilience, the capacity to mitigate and adapt to climate change, that's where the issue is. And so I find really the language of vulnerability that climate change brings opens up new possibilities that we're actually working on our vulnerability and human initiative initiative at Emory, where we are really looking at expanding the definition and the understanding of vulnerability away from marginalized, stigmatized groups, unfortunate groups that we have to try and rescue in some way, to really recognizing that under climate change, this is the reality for all of us. And so what does this mean in terms of the global regime that we've created to respond to this universal threat? Okay. And as you can see, basically loss and damage under climate change is huge, and one of the issues that, again, is positioned as, okay, small island states, coastal communities, poor countries in the global south, they're particularly vulnerable. The argument there is that it's really the global, the global status quo where we have uneven distribution of wealth between the north and the south, and even extractions of resources from south to north that have really led to this problem where we are now saying that certain communities or even certain parts of the world stand to suffer more under climate change than, if you like, the global north does. And so for an ecofeminist, one basically is looking at combining, sort of the ecological movement of protecting the earth and really moderating how we're interacting with our planet, with the women's liberation movement, and achieving a radical reshaping of the basic socioeconomic relations and the underlying values of our modern industrial society. Okay, so those values have brought us to this current moment where we're really facing a climate crisis. And the critique is that that sort of domination model of not just capitalism, not just even the foundations of how law was created, we now see it reflected in how our industrial model has so dominated what we depend on, which is the earth itself, to the point where now our own existence is threatened through unsustainable emissions. So in the climate context, the argument is made that climate change and overconsumption, whether we're looking at sort of global north, wealthy industrial country overconsumption, or even overconsumption in non-industrial states where the wealthy majority are definitely part of the group that are really raising the emission stakes, that this overconsumption is produced by a masculinist ideology that will not be solved by masculinist technoscience approaches. Okay, so I'm quoting God here. I don't know if she's on this webinar, but I was drawing largely a lot of my work from a paper that she wrote in 2015. And I won't go into the history of sort of ecofeminism. I'm going to take it that most of us are familiar with it, so I can just get my 15 minutes in. But certainly, I'm happy to go back to that history and see how it relates to climate change. Obviously, climate change being a piece of environmental law, all the arguments that we bring in for ecofeminism and looking at the environment and looking at ourselves as part of the environment rather than supreme over it and lording over it and therefore polluting it and ruining it, also are very relevant in the climate conversation. In non-industrial countries, you can see, women especially, this is a view of the Chipko women's movement that we all are very familiar with, that really set into motion in many ways the field of women and the environment and the ecofeminist contributions. But in many places we find, in non-industrial world, that women living in poverty really bear the burden of climate change, okay? They have more work fetching water, collecting fuel or fodder, okay? Duties traditionally assigned to them. The changing climate, you find that women have to walk further, they have to cope with less to provide for their families. When households experience food shortages, frequently women are the first to go without food. So we can see that sort of feminist issues are bound up in the climate problem as well. And for sure, a feminist approach to law and jurisprudence has to have a contribution in making a change. For example, we know that more women died, during Hurricane Katrina. We know that more women also died during the tsunami in Sumatra. And women who survived climate change disasters, such as those in Hurricane Katrina, for example, we've seen that usually in those moments of confusion and desperation, the likelihood of new assaults or sexual assault is, these kinds of problems also are very particular, very gendered problems emerge when climate crises hit a place. So climate change really exacerbates the existing pressures that marginalized people already have, and the economic and cultural elites are better able to mitigate these and postpone the impacts of climate change, even though we know that, sort of on a global, universal level, that postponement cannot be forever. Okay, we know that at some point, certainly by 2100, we would have to have made a complete shift if we still expect to be here and not to have raised temperatures to up to 4 degrees centigrade, Fahrenheit. So the interesting thing, of course, about women's voices and women's participation in the climate issue is that the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention, and the IPCC have finally noted that women and women's needs need to be brought to the center of climate change. And I think some of the other presenters will go beyond looking at women and looking at also other gender groups that have been traditionally and continue to be marginalized within law and within society. And so it's a promising thing that, the idea that we need to look at the experiences, say, of women in the global south, women in poor communities, and how climate change is impacting them, that it's finally on the table. But whether we're actually paying attention to, their experience and what that means for reorganizing this market-based approach to climate change response, that's where we're not seeing the answers. Because the different market-based projects that we have, even if it's, say, a clean energy project right here in Kenya, the money the local community gets does nothing to get them out of poverty, okay? The offsets that accrue to a country that's getting the permits for, whether it's a country X, I'll just pick any country that's doing this project in Kenya and is now offsetting its emissions back in the global north, the money that's being paid to the local community for their participation does not bring them out of poverty. It maintains the global status quo, the global standard of living that there is. So even these projects do not promise to change the urgent issues that women are facing when there's a drought or there's a flood or if you like, unsustainable rainfall patterns that they depend on for feeding their families, etc. At the end of the day, though, and it's clear that capitalist patriarchy is propelling us towards dangerous climate change, and not only must we rise above sort of the dichotomous approach to the climate regime of global north, global south, which we've tried to do under Paris by saying, this is now a universal program. Every country has to make its contributions, but there's still that distinction, okay? So the contribution that Kenya promises to make is really a drop in the bucket when you compare it to, say, China or the US contribution. At the end of the day, ecological feminist thinkers are also saying that we need to really look at our inner ecology. Okay, the soul and sense of the human being must also guide us individually and collectively into a relationship that really balances the human environment relation and defies these dichotomies. Such an approach that takes us deeper into what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to be a human that lives within an environment that we're completely dependent on physically. What does that mean in terms of the kind of norms that we will create for the climate regime and how we will operationalize them beyond the capitalist new market model that we have? And apologies for going over time.
No problem. Thank you very much. That was also incredibly interesting. I think you gave us a kind of incredible overview, actually, in a very short amount of time. And I think you kind of left us with some really fascinating questions. I can see the questions are coming in. So there will be an opportunity to come back to this. Staying on the topic of the climate crisis and of climate change, our third speaker today is Ellen Spanagel. Ellen is a research assistant and doctoral candidate at McGill University's Faculty of Law. As a research associate with the Canada Research Chair in Human Rights and the Environment, her research focuses on gender, sexual and romantic minority rights, vulnerabilities, and adaptation in the context of climate justice. And today her talk is going to examine the experiences and resistance of gender, sexual and romantic minorities to the climate crisis. So over to you, Ellen.
Perfect. So I'll just share my screen. Just give me a moment. All right. So my name is Ellen Spanigal, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you today to present on research that I have done with Cassandra Naranjan and Sébastien Jodoin on what is a vastly under-researched topic. And we are in the process of finalizing an article. And for me, this has been a process of learning and growing, and I'm really grateful to be in this space with all of you and to have already listened to our speakers, Atiano and Emily, and their knowledge and some of their knowledge, which I have drawn on in this research. So I will be speaking about the experiences and resistance of gender, sexual, and romantic minorities to the climate crisis and their role in promoting processes of decarbonization. So how is climate change affecting gender, sexual, and romantic minorities around the world? In the words of activists Philip Brown, Aletta Brady, and Anthony Torres, trans and queer communities, especially Black and Brown and low-income queer and trans people, live on the front lines of climate change. Many young queer and trans people do not have the resources or ability to flee verbal, emotional, and physical violence in their hometowns. Instead, around the world, they are often abandoned by family and forced onto the streets with little to no support to survive. And we have embarked on researching available knowledge on the impacts of climate change to gender, sexual, and romantic minorities and their role in resisting it. So in this presentation, I'll be first reviewing existing research on the vulnerabilities of gender, sexual, and romantic minority populations to the climate crisis and their adaptation. I'll then discuss the potential limitations of right-based approaches in the context of the climate crisis. And finally, I'll discuss the necessary role that gender, sexual, and romantic minority populations and communities can do and embody in imagining and enacting a transition to a low carbon future. So we have chosen to use the term gender, sexual, and romantic minorities, or GSRM, which I will be using throughout the rest of the presentation, in place of terms like LGBTQ, so as to encompass and acknowledge the diversity reflected not only individually, but for communities across cultures and geographies. I will also use the term queer in certain contexts. To be clear, the word queer in discussions of queerness do not and cannot represent all gender, sexual, and romantic minority individuals, and should also be viewed critically. However, given its predominance in research, a discussion of its importance to many gender, sexual, and romantic minority individuals and communities is necessary in the context of enabling climate action. I also want to recognize the value in situating our identities in relation to the research. Much of the research explored specifically examines context within the Global South. We want to acknowledge that we do not occupy the space in most of the regions examined, and that our position in the Global North brings great privilege, responsibility, and margin to harm. We aim to present the facts as they have appeared in academia, while also situating the resilience and agency of those made vulnerable by these global systems of oppression, and at the same time recognize our role in perpetuating, benefiting from, and also questioning these systems. So GSRM individuals and communities are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. So why is there so little research on their vulnerabilities and their adaptation? Overarchingly, a movement towards gender mainstreaming and research on climate vulnerabilities has become more prevalent. However, international literature and frameworks analyzing the implications of gender on vulnerability or adaptation have almost solely focused on women, and specifically heterosexual and cisgender women. Within the national adaptation plans listed on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so the UNFCCC, gender is included as a consideration in all of them, however, only in reference to the vulnerabilities women face. Kiribati is the only country to have mentioned sexual orientation in their plan, but only once. So employed as a catch-all term, gender can hide the fact that women, men, queer, and trans people are not situated equally in terms of environmental oppression. Because of this, we wanted to compile existing research on the vulnerabilities of GSRM as well as their adaptation. And this research is indispensable in bringing the distinct challenges faced by these individuals and communities to the forefront. Where research on the vulnerabilities of GSRM to climate change has been done, it's been done largely in the context of climate-related disasters and natural disasters more generally. And through this research, we can see common threads of discriminatory legislation and severe impacts to housing and healthcare for GSRMs. So many of the challenges GSRM face during and post-disaster are a result of discriminatory attitudes embedded within the highest levels of government and policy. Despite the evident negative impacts on GSRM individuals post-disaster and their needs are absent from disaster planning. And scholars have noted that these individuals and communities did not receive appropriate warnings before, during, or after storms. And the needs of GSRM individuals and communities are not adequately represented in disaster relief policies. And this can be seen, for example, through the binary assumptions of gender that have left gender minorities, including trans and third gender people, excluded from relief efforts. And this can be seen, for example, in research done on the experiences of the third gender Araggani people in Tamil Nadu, India, after the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, where both the local government and NGOs denied Araggani people access to temporary shelter and livelihood through the absence of government-provided identification. But the impacts to housing extend beyond being able to access temporary shelters during disaster. For example, for GSRM individuals, home is often a place of relative privacy in which sexual and/or gender identities can be performed, which can make temporary housing and shelters particularly problematic. Gender minorities, particularly trans people, are especially vulnerable and are hyper-surveilled and controlled in disaster situations. For example, in Japan, after the 2011 tsunami, many trans people found themselves in a state of forced coming out during evacuation, and this can result in emotional trauma, but also in violence and harassment. And healthcare is another important area of vulnerability for GSRM during climate disasters. During the same tsunami in 2011 that I mentioned, it was reported that gay or bisexual men with HIV/AIDS sometimes lost access to their necessary medical treatment as the disaster destroyed hospitals and transportation facilities. And specific challenges have also been noted for trans people. Many trans people rely on hormone therapy, and some hormones must be stored in specific environmental conditions, so not as to degrade or become less effective. And this can be a problem when heating and cooling becomes unavailable. And not only is a lack of hormones both emotionally and psychologically distressing, but is also physiologically disruptive. However, all of these considerations have been absent from disaster planning. And although research exists on vulnerabilities to disaster, even less has been documented when we're talking about long-term impacts of climate change. However, some research has outlined several important impacts in the context of health and displacement. For example, studies in the US have been done to show that same-sex partner households are inequitably exposed to hazardous air pollutants, which lead to disproportionate health impacts such as lung cancer or asthma. And migration is another important long-term impact of climate change that has been examined. The vulnerabilities and adaptation of displaced GSRM individuals and families in the context of the climate crisis is significant, given the heightened displacement of GSRM persons domestically and the discrimination faced by GSRM asylum seekers internationally. When GSRM communities are excluded from disaster planning and global problem solving, they are made further vulnerable in having to rely predominantly upon their own adaptive capacities, as opposed to being supported by states, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders. GSRM individuals have been excluded from decision-making and leadership around adaptation, though their involvement proves to be beneficial for all. For example, during a disaster risk reduction project in the Philippines, Bacla individuals helped plan community evacuation, acknowledging their insight during disasters, and this helped reduce anti-Bacla discrimination in the region. And this highlights the need for diverse gender minorities to define their own needs and determine potential solutions alongside governmental agencies and NGOs in the context of disaster risk reductions. So what are the barriers that stand in the way of the recognition and protection of GSRM individuals and community rights in the context of climate change? Though the Yogyakarta Principles Plus 10 and action occurring within the UN, such as the appointment of an LGBT special rapporteur, the informal LGBTI core group, and the recognition of GSRM civil society groups and NGOs have been significant in advancing the rights of GSRM at the global level, there are no treaties mapping specific protections for GSRM individuals like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In the absence of a global legal code, GSRM rights are only secured through broad treaties, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and these do not account for the specificities inherent to the challenges facing these individuals and communities, such as the disproportionate criminalization of GSRM people worldwide. These gaps at the international level also translate into gaps within domestic governance and environmental regulation. For example, within Canada's Environmental Impact Assessment Act, the intersection of sex and gender with other identity factors is listed as a factor to be considered. However, it is buried among a long list of factors, and because of this has thus far failed to consider the broader needs of GSRM individuals and communities in environmental assessment. Ultimately, an approach solely grounded in human rights instruments can have the effect of adapting and accommodating existing norms and further marginalizing GSRM individuals and communities. And because of this, may not account for the transformations necessary to promote a process of decarbonization. Because of this, we have examined and believe that future scholarship should examine the direct role that GSRM individuals, communities play in the climate crisis as agents. And we posit that there are 3 critical ways that they are agents in the transition to a low carbon economy. This includes their knowledge, their activism, and transgressive aspects of their cultures. So first, we think GSRM can enhance the climate resilience of societies to climate impacts. There are countless examples where GSRM have created networks of care and kinship during times of crisis that should serve as important models. This is especially prevalent in research done on the HIV/AIDS crisis, which has led to GSRM communities across multiple geographies to provide support mechanisms for the members of their community. As Alexia Arani writes, long before COVID-19, many trans queer people of color were redistributing wealth, sharing meals, offering rides, and opening up our homes while struggling to gain the support we need in the face of rampant racialized, gendered violence, and structural inequalities. GSRM knowledge on kinship and mutual aid provides frameworks for how families and networks exist and support one another in periods of dislocation and instability. Secondly, we think that GSRM individuals and communities can build on their successful track records of activism and mobilize their communities by connecting GSRM liberation and climate justice struggles. The power of GSRM NGOs and communities, both regionally and globally, should not be underestimated. There are many strategies to be learned from the legal and political victories of GSRM communities to enhance climate justice. For example, Casey Miller's research on queer NGOs and kinships in China have shown that NGOs became an increasingly crucial component of the Chinese government's response to HIV/AIDS. The political power of GSRM activism can bolster climate action. And moreover, although displacement and migration are a key concern for GSRM individuals in relation to climate change, studies have also been done to show that migration can serve as an impetus for more enhanced and transnationally oriented queer activism. This transnational activism could leverage activism in relation to climate justice on a global scale, seeing climate justice and GSRM mobilization as interconnected struggles. And finally, we think that GSRM communities can draw on the transgressive aspects of their cultures and communities to rethink the status quo and promote processes of decarbonization. GSRM perspectives offer knowledge on how ideas about gender and sexuality shape perceptions about climate change and climate action. For example, scholars have argued that a preference to adhere to gender role norms may particularly influence men's engagement in sustainable consumption. GSRM individuals have been shown to be more likely to take up sustainable behavior and commit to environmentally positive action. Moreover, other queer critiques have condemned the mainstream sustainability movement for its propensity to put reproduction at the center, particularly in policy. As Cameron Butler has argued, such a focus on reproduction erases the notion of communities and of broader networks of support and solidarity, and contributes to xenophobia domestically and racist sexual regulation globally. So it's critical to recognize that these theories are carried out by real people. By acknowledging that these theories manifest in the day-to-day lives of GSRM further asserts the value of learning from GSRM knowledge for climate justice aims. And as Kim Hall notes, the future of climate change will be queer and disabled in the sense that current norms for privileged human life, including mobility and the planet's climate, will not be in operation. And in acknowledging the existence of gender, sexual, and romantic minorities, their role and their value in climate justice, be it their everyday adaptation, political participation, theorizing, and/or solidarity work, solutions can be devised that fill the gaps missing in traditional academic and political discourse regarding climate change solutions. As a last note, it is important to recognize that more research needs to be done. Decentralized research that examines the role of GSRM regionally and in more local contexts, particularly in the global south, is necessary. Recognizing the specific role of trans women, lesbians, non-binary people, intersex people, and others can further nuance the conversation and avoid homogenizing GSRM as a singular monolith to be accommodated. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thanks so much, Ellen. I think that was really interesting. I think kind of thinking not only about marginalization, but also the ways in which marginalization kind of positions certain communities as epistemic experts is really important and interesting. Our last speaker today is Nicholas Stamp. Nicholas is a faculty member with the George R. Farmer Junior Law Library at West Virginia University College of Law. His scholarship explores environmental law, critical legal theory, social movements, and Appalachian and rural studies. His new book, Remaking Appalachia, I'm sorry, Nicholas, Eco-Socialism, Ecofeminism, and Law, explores bottom-up approaches to system change in the US and coordinated regional and global methods. You can find a link to his book on the Elgar website. And today his talk is on radical intersections, critical environmental human rights, and ecofeminist eco-socialism in the US Appalachian region. Over to you, Nick.
So hello, y'all. First, I would like to echo our other panelists' comments, thanking our organizers for this fantastic webinar today. I have so enjoyed everyone's talks so far, and I really do look forward to the discussions and the questions that will soon follow. And I will keep a close eye on my time for these 15 minutes. So I will indeed be discussing my new book titled Remaking Appalachia, Eco-Socialism, Ecofeminism, and Law. It was published just this month with my home university, the West Virginia University Press. So just to start off with some background information, if folks are a bit unfamiliar or somewhat unfamiliar with the US Appalachian region, and really any pronunciation is fine for Appalachia, some folks say Appalachia rather than Appalachia. The question of what constitutes the Appalachian region is something of a contested question within the Appalachian studies literature. I think it's right to contest the geographic boundaries of the region. But for today's purposes, just for some brief introductory purposes, I thought I could use the sort of mainstream definition of the region that's provided by the Appalachian Regional Commission, or ARC. So according to ARC, Appalachia spans these 13 US states, right? Only one state, which is my home state of West Virginia, is completely within the ARC designated Appalachian boundaries. Furthermore, ARC has broken up Appalachia into 5 subregions, right? So in my book, I mostly focus on Central Appalachia, which is represented here in yellow. It is Central Appalachia that has had historically intensive coal mining practices. It's also had profound environmental justice issues along lines of class, gender, and race as intersecting along compound lines. And to this day, Central Appalachia remains among the most subordinated and impoverished regions in the United States. And so when you often hear of quote unquote Appalachia being discussed in the national or international media, it is Central Appalachia that media commentators are typically referring to. So in the book, I focus a lot on Central Appalachia. I also do discuss North Central Appalachia, which is my home region, and some aspects of Northern Appalachia as well. There also has historically been intensive coal mining practices in these regions. And furthermore, in the last 2 decades, there has been a natural gas boom and related chemical sector renaissance, unfortunately, in this region as well. So when you hear talk of the Marcellus shale gas boom, the Yucatan shale gas boom, it is in north central and northern Appalachia predominantly. So again, scholars do rightly challenge this broad definition of Appalachia and also the subregions provided by ARC. But if you're somewhat unfamiliar with the region, I think that's a helpful starting place, not least of all because it's such an influential breakdown of the region. So also for introductory purposes, Appalachia is often discussed as a regional U.S. National sacrifice zone. Discussed in this way, a lot of the literature I used Rebecca R. Scott's excellent book, Removing Mountains, just as one notable example of where the region is talked about as a sacrifice zone. And this is because for more than a century, both the coal industry and the oil and gas industries have profoundly devastated the Appalachian landscape, also exploited the people, again, along intersecting lines, in order to most directly accumulate capital. But per the sacrifice zone model, it's also that Appalachia is sacrificed for the rest of the nation in order to keep the energy prices as cheap as possible. All right, so I think that's a helpful way to sort of have an entry point into the region if you're somewhat unfamiliar with it. What you see pictured here is what's called a mountaintop removal mining site. That's when mining operators, as the name suggests, simply chop off the top of mountains. Actually, they blow them up to efficiently get at the coal seams beneath. It's an extraordinarily destructive practice, as this picture indicates. In the literature, it's discussed as being more akin to a volcanic eruption than to classic surface or underground mining, or to something like deforestation. And to date, more than 500 mountains have been destroyed by mountaintop removal mining, and more than 2,000 miles of ecologically crucial headwater streams have been buried under the rubble produced by mountaintop removal mining. And that's predominantly happened in central Appalachia, the mountaintop removal mining practices. And in addition to the ecological impacts, of course, there are the corresponding public health, economic and social impacts, that also are very profound and have been well examined in the literature. So that's an example of a mountaintop removal mining site. On the left, what you see is what a quote unquote reclaimed mountaintop removal mining site can look like. So even after they have been reclaimed, to the extent that they are reclaimed by the industry, they continue to be extraordinarily polluting. Here you're seeing acid mine runoff, polluting with toxic chemicals, mostly heavy metals, a stream located adjacent to a mountaintop removal site. So even as coal does decline in Appalachia and in the US, we're going to have these long-standing environmental and related socioeconomic issues going forward for decades to come. Again, not even to mention the natural gas industry and associated petrochemical renaissance in Appalachia. Right, so again, that was just some helpful background information, I hope, if folks are a little bit less familiar with the region and its issues. So back to the book. What was the purpose of the book, the thesis essentially? So in the book, I do argue that environmental law has comprehensively failed the US Appalachian region. So rather than more law reform, within the liberal paradigm, we rather need genuine systemic reformations in Appalachia and beyond, of course, coordinated nationally and globally. And of course, by systemic reformations, I'm talking about critical legal theory, as in the case of the book, and much of my other work, informed by the Marxian tradition in particular, so economic base, political and legal superstructure and all that, Obviously, it's going to be the actual white patriarchal capitalist system that has to be overcome, again, in Appalachia and beyond, in order to address the ecological and related economic and social problems in the Appalachian region. Also, of course, as the book's title suggests, I'm drawing particularly on eco-socialism and a materialist socialist ecofeminism, and examining these potential ways forward in Appalachia. So this is the table of contents of the book. Obviously, I cover a lot of historical ground in the earlier chapters. I'm not going to talk about that today. Instead, I thought I would zero in on one particular aspect of the book, which is where in the latter chapters, I discuss one potential novel mechanism for more transformative change, again, in potentially in Appalachia and beyond, right? So I'll zero in on just one aspect of the book for today's purposes. And that is ecological recommoning, right? So in the book, I put forth a largely novel and I hope helpful mechanism to achieve ecological recommoning in particular, right? And so specifically in the book, I look at a critically informed approach to the public trust doctrine as is entwined with, again, a critical approach to environmental human rights. And again, this whole conversation in the book is undergirded and informed by both eco-socialism and materialist socialist ecofeminism. And so I will discuss that proposal a bit more in depth here in a moment. First, I did just want to acknowledge a lot of the fantastic literature that I draw on in the book and that I sort of situate myself within before I turn to my own proposal. Again, I thought it might be interesting for folks who perhaps are a little bit less familiar with with my home region. So Reed and Taylor's Recovering the Commons is an excellent work. It uses a materialist feminist lens among other analyses. And as part of the book, they touch on Appalachia, and they note that for hundreds of years, really, parts of the Appalachian citizenry have already nurtured and adopted aspects of an ecological commons. So there is a history there, and plenty of other folks, Ronald Eller has written about it, have discussed the historical use of and nurturing of ecological commons in Appalachia. In terms of more modern work, Joyce M. Barry has authored an excellent book called Standing Our Ground. And in fact, she uses a feminist eco-socialist lens in part in this book to discuss how contemporary, or then contemporary, Appalachian women activists against mountaintop removal mining specifically support commoning, or can be said to support commoning in central Appalachia. Among others, Barry draws on some of Shiva and Mai's work on ecofeminism. And then Stephen Stahl wrote Ramp Hollow, that was released just a few years ago, another very interesting book discussing recommoning in Appalachia. Stahl suggests as a form of hypothetical federal US legislation, a Commons Communities Act, or essentially a federal act that would help effectuate land or ecological commons for hunting, farming, and so forth in Central Appalachia, and notes more in the radical democracy tradition. And again, looking at what's happened in Appalachia for the past several hundred years, Appalachians can do it themselves by squatting on abandoned land and defending their rights to the commons. And I can say, being from West Virginia, being raised around abandoned mining sites and absentee land, not unusual for folks in Appalachia already, we can say, to perhaps view some of these abandoned or absentee lands as de facto commons. And then lastly, I draw on the work of course, Mary Wood and Weston and Valliere in terms of the specific mechanism that I propose, which is the public trust doctrine entwined with environmental human rights. So just in my last few minutes, what do I do in the book? Well, essentially, I break and remake these doctrines, right? Because traditionally, of course, they've been conceived of from within the liberal paradigm. So instead, I want to, of course, radically reconceive them, perhaps in line with eco-socialism, eco-socialist, ecofeminism. And to do this, I use a radical frame transformation of the social action frame involving these two doctrines, relying on Taylor's work, among others. And in that mode, essentially, radical cause lawyers, radical community lawyers would deploy radically transformed frames of the public trust doctrine entwined with environmental human rights to help actually achieve ecological recommoning, right? Which is not what the liberal doctrines, of course, traditionally do. So essentially, the transformed public trust doctrine would involve new bottom-up, radical, grassroots-driven state action to create the ecological commons. This is just a quote from my book. An eco-socialist approach involves inverting, or can involve, inverting the neoliberal usage of the state for enhancing the process of commodification and to instead enhancing the practices of commonification instead, right? Drawing here and quoting from Commons Against Capitalism. And so then entwined with this is transformed environmental human rights, right? So again, environmental human rights as informed by a critical approach to environmental justice and critical approach to environmental human rights along the lines of, in terms of intersectional approach, race, gender, indigenous issues, LGBTQ+ issues, also more broadly speaking, entwined with issues of neocolonialism, neo-imperialism, other global South, global North divide type issues. And then also, of course, I use an entwined materialist, eco-socialist feminism, accounting for, when we're talking about ecological recombining in Appalachia and beyond, compound forms of oppression, centering reproductive labor and caregiving work, discussing subsistence and solidarity economies and how they would intersect potentially with Appalachian recombining efforts. And of course, much literature has discussed the fact that the vast majority of Appalachian environmental activists and leaders are women. So here I'm drawing on the work of Ariel Sala, a lot of regional scholars such as Barry and Shannon Elizabeth Bell. And lastly, I just had a little snapshot here of one passage in the book that's sort of talking about what a bottom-up radical grassroots approach to ecological recombining could look like in the book. Again, specifically, as a legal scholar, as driven in part by radical cause lawyers, other allied organizers. And of course, I emphasize in the book that, it's impossible to have local and regional systemic reformations beyond white patriarchal capitalism alone. We have to have per eco-socialism and ecofeminism, broader collective ownership of the means of production, and democratic economic planning at all geographic levels. Of course, as also steeped in a materialist approach, allowing for differences based on region, locality throughout the world, and of course, global North and South divide, and so forth. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. That was really interesting. I mean, I think it was kind of a good way to end in a way, because it brought us from quite an international picture to thinking about it at a more regional level. But as you say, one can't think about these things only regionally. One needs to think about kind of revolutionary, radical grassroots change at a global level. Thank you to all our panelists. This has been a really kind of diverse and fascinating, and I think you've touched on sort of very varied themes, but at the same time, there are interesting echoes across the different presentations we've heard today. I have lots of questions, but I know that my job as the chair is not just to ask my questions, but to ask you some questions from the floor. So if I could ask all our speakers to turn on their cameras, and I'm gonna do that now. The first question we have today is for Atieno. The question is, and there are kind of two parts to this question. In assessing clean energy, are we only assessing GHG contributions? Are we taking into account the metal and mineral demands initiated by the demand for clean energy? What are the gendered lenses of clean energy?
Oh, definitely a mouthful there. Yes, and your first comment is right, that when we're talking about clean energy, we really just focused on emissions. Unfortunately, that's sort of where the landscape is right now. In terms of the metal and mineral demands generated, the responsible way, of course, to go around that would be to aim for climate neutral extraction, meaning that, sort of the wind energy, the geothermal energy, the clean energy generated is actually equal to, or in fact greater than the emissions that would be generated from extracting these minerals. But I'm interested in any thoughts you may have on that particular question for the person who asked it, okay? And then in terms of the gendered lenses, certainly when you're looking at like rural communities, agrarian communities, if you're say looking at a wind energy project in Kenya, one of the interesting things around a project like that is that, the grazing lands for the local communities in that area are not affected because the animals can graze around the wind, the windmills. And so what this has done is that it's reduced the sort of male out migration that's been typical for rural communities. So depending on, sort of the clean energy path that one takes, it can mitigate some of the social problems we've seen with the introduction of a cash economy that has seen, men migrate out to earn cash. And so that has increased women's workloads, including taking care of large animals, which is not just a physical problem for the women, but also just trying to balance their normal responsibilities in the home. So things like the wind energy project that we have in Ngong Hills in Kenya, that's been a really interesting sort of gender dynamic. When you look at like the geothermal energy project again that we have in Kenya, the skilled, semi-skilled or low-skilled work that comes with some of these projects, usually it's, again, the young men and some of the older men in the community that take on these jobs, which the gendered impact of that is, again, increased workloads for the women who don't have access to that work and who then have to make up for the roles that have been left at home. Because, of course, as we know, for a lot of rural communities, the work division is usually along gendered lines. So if one gender is missing, the other one has to take on more of that workload. And that's what we see for the women. So that's, but I'm really curious about if you've got any thoughts around sort of the metal and mineral demands as well. Because my initial thought is about, just making it climate neutral would be the responsible thing to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Etienne. That's very interesting. And of course, we're a network and would encourage you to find each other and talk to each other either through us or through the chat function here. But your comment also made me think of Nick's reference to sacrifice zone models made me also think about that in the context of sort of climate mitigation, and maybe even the idea of sacrifice communities, what work gets done in that calculation of carbon. But thank you very much. That's very interesting. This is a question that's directed at Emily and others, it says, and it's a question, I guess, about how one frames the problem. So this person asks about particularly the framing of the Anthropocene and whether we should be thinking about anthroparchy, anthroprivilege, and I think that's a question maybe all of our panelists could think about. How do when we're thinking about feminist or queer perspectives, what does that mean for how we kind of frame the moment we're in? Do you want to give that a shot, Emily?
Yeah, I could start us off maybe, but I think as you said, Dina, I think some of our other panelists probably have a lot to say about this as well. But yeah, I mean, I think thinking about anthroprivilege, etc., is really important, because we need to bring this intersectional lens, and that was something I was trying to get across a little bit in my very rushed talk. So I think Etienne's talk on this was really important. Thinking about how the global South will be most impacted by climate change, and how women are also often most impacted, and Ellen's paper on this as well, and how GSRM people are going to be impacted differently. I think that's so important. So, and I guess my answer would be, again, need to think about anthropocentrism alongside this humanism, and that's for me where this kind of post-human feminism comes together. So not just kind of anthropocentrism, sorry, it's such a hard word to say sometimes, itself, but also who is the kind of anthropos subject. It is, again, the kind of white male middle class able-bodied heterosexual man, really. So that would be kind of my answer, but I'm sure the others have lots to say too.
Any thoughts on that from maybe Ellen or Nick? Not to put you on the spot.
Although I recognize its shortcomings and limitations, I tend to use the capitalist scene in my own work, right? Drawing on eco-socialism, eco-Marxism, socialist ecofeminism. I do think it's the capitalist mode of production that's most responsible for the global ecological crisis per se. And so it's the word that I tend to use, I guess. Sometimes I drop footnotes and talk about some of the other ones. I'm thinking of Moore's work, Anthropocene or Capitalocene, excellent work on it. But yeah, I tend to use Capitalocene.
I was just going to talk very briefly. When I was doing some of my research, and like I hadn't included a lot of this in the paper just because a lot of this is more theoretical, but like I'm thinking of Greta Gard, and I know Atiana, like you were talking about Greta, there's a lot of research on humans and biological essentialism, and how like we have imported like these ideas, essentialist ideas about biology and like the gender and sex binaries into sustainability frameworks. And that's, you can see that especially like in frameworks in reproduction and sexual regulation. So I think that's also an important element when we're thinking about you know, placing the human at the center.
Thanks. Atiana?
Just really quickly to follow on Ellen's comment, I think one of the things that definitely comes through are, you know, some of the other qualities that Ellen, you were mentioning in your paper that need to come into the discourse. You know, care, sharing, kinship, you know, this is not what capitalism is built on. So I think that's, you know, sort of a really useful contribution as we're looking at, you know, sort of the anthro and how has anthro even been defined in the capitalist model. And as we look at reshaping that model, we definitely have to look at, you know, what are the broader qualities of a human being rather than just those that have been captured in that model.
I am going to abuse my platform slightly to ask a follow-up question, which is really for all four of you, because I think, and I think it's kind of implied in some of this discussion about the Anthropocene, kind of what's significant is not only identifying kind of practices of oppression and marginalization associated with certain kinds of environmental regulations and environmental crises, but also, as you've all said, the highlighting of other methods and other voices and other priorities and other ways of kind of responding to and thinking about our relationships to the environment. But that makes me wonder whether we aren't shifting responsibility onto those who've kind of done the least to put us in this position, to sort of solve the problem created by those who continue to contribute to the problem. Are we, when we start thinking about grassroots approaches or women's approaches, or kind of looking to queer communities for solutions, are we handing responsibility to those who are least responsible for the problems we find ourselves in? Should I do it in the order you spoke? Emily?
That's the kind of curse of being in the first, wasn't it? I think it's a really difficult question. I guess in some ways there's always a risk with kind of, well, there's also a risk of just kind of including voices supposedly and not actually genuinely listening to them. And I think that would be kind of my main concern here. Yeah, I guess whether we're shifting responsibility, I mean, that is also clearly a big problem in terms of, especially if we're thinking about kind of global south, global north, I think that becomes a really big problem. But I think the main concern for me would be like genuinely actually listening to these different perspectives and taking them seriously. And for now, I just think for the most part, they're not taken seriously enough. So I guess that's my very brief answer, and maybe someone can help me out there.
I think in addition to listening to the voices is also taking and applying some of the solutions that they're already offering, because you know, the status quo is not interested in solutions because they're gaining from the status quo, so they're not looking for solutions. And so what we're saying from these other voices is that not only do we have a different way of looking at it, but we also have potentially different ways of approaching the problem that are really hopeful. And so these should be actually part of the global solution. And so not so much that we just hand it to them and say, well, since it looks like you have some kind of solution, then you solve the problem. No, the problem is squarely on the shoulders of, you know, capitalist patriarchy. But because capitalist patriarchy is not going to open itself up to new ideas, you know, we have to find our way in there, and not just with the ideas, but also with the methods that we're bringing to the table.
I think a lot of what Emily and Ationa said, like I would echo. But I would just add, like, there is also a lot of research already on like the different strategies that these communities use, and not like just in relation to climate justice, but like in terms of like kinship and like mutual aid networks of support. Like we know that GSRM people like rely on social support. If you know, like someone has been alienated from their family or has been experiencing homelessness, we know that they rely on organizations that act as safer spaces for them, and they create alternative families. So if policymakers and other stakeholders already know this, because there's so much research on this, then they can direct funding towards the organizations and parties that are helping enable that for these people. I don't think like I think that like, yes, like we should be listening to the voices of these people in these communities, but also there's a lot of research that other allies can do on their own and start directing like meaningful change in those areas.
I can also echo the fact that those were, I thought, wonderful and on-point comments by everyone. I can only add that in the Appalachian context, Shannon Elizabeth Bell, for instance, has done a lot of work on how we might attract more men to the environmental justice movement by maybe reframing some of the language that is used, or reframing some of the environmental justice topics through just using a different sort of rhetorics that might be more resonant with some in the Appalachian region. And then a lot of the work on progressive just transitions and radical just transitions often also talk about social action frames and rhetorics, right, associated with sort of winning over, right, the more traditional coal mining areas, for instance, in Appalachia.
Thank you all. Those are fantastic answers. I'm conscious that we might be out of time. I'm looking to Katie to see if we are. But maybe we have time for one more question. Katie, how are we doing?
Yeah, I think that would be wonderful. Just one more. It's been a wonderful time, but for the video, it helps to keep it kind of close to the 90 minutes.
I'm going to, I can see lots of really great questions, many of which sort of really dig into the details of your arguments, and choosing a last one is hard. So I'm picking a little bit randomly. It's a question for Emily. It says, if I understand you correctly, your partial conclusion seems to be that post-humanist lenses could serve as less anthropocentric alternative to environmental law, and more importantly, potentially change the way we think of nature as a vibrant subject of rights. But given all the difficulties you rightly point out, namely representability, nature's agency, etc., is it at all worthwhile to grant rights as traditionally understood to nature? Many thanks for such an illuminating talk and paper.
Wow, what a question to end on. This is kind of the question, isn't it? And I see that was a question, there were two questions kind of similar on this theme, on kind of the limits of rights, etc. So I kind of will try and address both of them at the same time because they're quite similar. So I think, yeah, really thinking about how rights are it's a very problematic framework in some ways. And so then if I'm kind of calling for post-human feminism to start thinking about rights of nature and pushing for that, how can I manage that tension? You know, we know that rights in many ways have been critiqued by feminists for being, again, white and very male, very focused on the kind of liberal individual. There have been challenges to that through economic and social rights, through kind of more communal rights framings, but that's kind of the dominant framework. And we also know that rights, and human rights in particular, have provided a kind of governance project in some ways for, in many ways, they kind of police women and their bodies. And I think the best example here is really kind of thinking about the banning of the veil that we saw across many European countries, and the kind of Islamophobic, racist discourse, which allowed this to be seen as a women's rights cause in many ways. So I think, you know, and many Indigenous peoples also reject the rights of nature and call for example, in Australia, caring for country approaches. So this is really hard. And I think the question here becomes, can rights of nature actually help reimagine rights altogether? Can we think about rights very differently? But at the same time, what's the risk in kind of collapsing into that, you know, problematic rights framework by calling for the rights of nature? And I know I see that Jeffrey Garver is on this call as well, and his recent chapter in From Environmental Law to Ecological Law is really, really good on how can we reimagine rights as relationships. And I think that that's one really interesting answer, you know, emphasizing these connections between humans, non-humans, environments, etc. So yeah, I guess kind of, and I think, you know, what Nick was talking about in terms of commonification, that I also can't say very well, is another kind of way of thinking about this. So yeah, I think this is kind of where I want my work to go next in many ways. How can this actually challenge the dominant framings of rights that we have, and do that in that way without, you know, actually collapsing into the same problematic discourses that we have, which is the reason why so many Indigenous peoples have actually rejected rights of nature. So a sort of semi-answer to your question there, but really great questions. That's really the core one, I think. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I'm very sad we're out of time, but we are. This has been an incredibly interesting panel. I think the kind of themes around the ways in which our current practices sort of claim to sort of deal with the problem, but actually maintain the status quo, as Atieno said, and thinking about sort of new radical, feminist, queer, community-based solutions that are both kind of within and outside our existing legal frameworks are so critical. It's been incredibly interesting. Thank you all. Thank you very much to Elgar for having us. Thank you very much to the audience for your really fascinating questions. And I really hope we find lots of ways to carry on talking to each other and networking and engaging in this conversation going forward. There was one last thing I wanted to say before we go, which is just to tell you about the May webinar. It's happening on the 18th of May. It's hosted by the Earth Law Center, and it's on the topic Educating and Swaying Judges and Politicians, which is maybe a good follow-on from working from within and working from without. So please go and check out Elgar's website. Please go and check out the GNHRE website and join us if you'd like to. Thank you to all of our panelists, and have a great morning, evening, afternoon to all of you.